Welcome back. You're watching Today. Now, we are expecting stage 5 load shedding throughout winter with little reprieve for cash-strapped South Africans. Now, most people can't afford a solar system or even an inverter to lighten that load. So, what are some of the most cost-effective alternatives that are out there when load shedding does hit? Let's take a look at those. So we did a bit of research in terms of the alternative ways in which you could keep the lights on in your home as well as stay connected when there is load shedding. So a gas stove can save you up to 30% of your electricity bill, but it can be quite expensive to buy. So another option would be a smaller gas stove, and you're looking here at about 600 to 3,000 Rand for a 1 or 2 plate. For your cell phone, you have the easy option of a power bank. But remember to charge the power bank before load shedding hits. In this situation, you're looking at about 300 Rand to 700 Rand for the kind of power bank that will keep you connected and your devices on through load shedding. These, of course, include laptops as well as tablets. Let's take a look at some other alternatives that you consider through the load shedding as well. There are rechargeable bulbs. You can buy rechargeable light bulbs to see through you for at least a 2-hour slot during load shedding. And for those working from home, a UPS is absolutely necessary, but they don't come cheap. You're looking at about 1,000 Rand for a good backup system that will power your Wi-Fi, television, and your basics while we are experiencing load shedding. But at the end of the day, remember that their lifespan is limited, and it has been advised by those in the know that they have to be replaced between 12 to 18 months after they've been bought. It might not be the best solution, but at least you have some light and some connectivity when you're experiencing that stage 5 or stage 6 load shedding, even stage 8 that's been warned by Eskom for the winter period. Now, families are forced to bury their loved ones quicker than before or pay hefty costs due to the rolling blackouts. Funeral parlours are struggling to keep their cold storages running during those power cuts. And this is one of the many impacts caused by the rolling blackouts on businesses and people's livelihoods. Metropolitan estimates that South Africans can pay up to 123,000 Rand in funeral costs alone. Executive Head of Client and Business Solutions at Metropolitan, Abulela Gazi, joins us in the studio to discuss this further. Thank you for your time this afternoon. And I mean, you've just seen there, we're talking about alternatives to the blackouts because this seems to be a reality that's going to stay with us for a very long time. For the context for our viewers, give us a sense of what the funeral industry is currently going through when it comes to the blackouts and how they're able to navigate them, if at all.
Sure. I think the first point that you mentioned, which is unfortunate, is the fact that this load shedding seems to be with us indefinitely. And it is having a material impact on businesses across South Africa. What we are seeing in the funeral industry specifically is that the load shedding is directly contributing to the increase in funeral costs across the board. If you think about a funeral parlour, you mentioned earlier on that they need to keep the bodies cool so that they don't decay very quickly. And so a lot of funeral parlours now are incurring significant additional costs to deliver a value proposition to customers that make sense. You can appreciate if you're a customer and you take your loved one to a funeral parlour, you want them to deliver the best service for you. You want them to protect and stop the decay of the body of your loved one. And therefore, they need the refrigerators to do that. They're spending thousands of rands on generators to keep the refrigerators on, and those thousands are then passed on to the consumer. So certainly we're seeing an increase in the price of funerals because of load shedding. Granted, load shedding is but an element. You could argue that load shedding is a material element currently, but there are other reasons why we're seeing increases in funeral costs, specifically the economy, economic factors, rising fuel prices, rising inflation, rising interest rates, and all of those contribute to the price of these funerals. And lastly, what we've seen is culturally, despite the fact that COVID, we saw a lot of families having smaller funerals, a lot of families kind of prioritizing just kind of loved ones, not the broader communities. We're seeing it revert back to pre-COVID levels, where a lot of families now are starting to host really extravagant, really big funerals. And if you consider the costs as well as the size, that then results in significant increases in costs of hosting funerals. But certainly load shedding playing its part, and it's making it more and more difficult for funeral parlours to not only remain operational, but to deliver an appropriate value proposition to the customers that they serve.
So what can these funeral parlours do in these times? I said it in my intro that load shedding is here to stay, and so some kind of adapting is going to need to happen. What are you seeing in terms of how they've been able to do that, if at all?
So firstly, naturally, all funeral parlours by law are required to have a generator. And so the use of those generators is starting to be more and more prominent. Unfortunately, if you consider how much they're spending on fuel as a result, it could be between 2,000 Rand a day to as much as 5,000 Rand a day. And in a month, that's a substantial cost. So we're seeing a lot of funeral parlours utilising these generators on an ongoing basis. And you'll appreciate the generators were more for backup, whereas now they're becoming more of a keep the lights on for 12 hours. And so these generators weren't designed, when the funeral parlour purchased the generators, it wasn't to purchase the generator for prolonged outages, but more for when there's a blackout here and there. And so these generators are now decaying, also resulting in these funeral parlours having to invest in more generating power to then keep the lights on. And it's materially impacting the small funeral parlours. It is a shame. It is a shame that these businesses are being crippled by load shedding, and some businesses are struggling really to keep their doors open. However, one of the things that has been encouraging is that consumers are coming to the aid of the funeral parlours. Instead of a consumer having a body in the parlour for seven days and the like, consumers are now burying loved ones a lot more quicker. To reduce the costs that they incur naturally, but also to put less pressure on the funeral parlour itself. And so we're starting to see some of that cultural change in the industry. But the reality is you almost need money to run a business, a lot more money to run a business in this day and age. And that is materially impacting the profitability of these funeral parlours and impacting not only the funeral parlours, but the end consumers, because now it's inconvenience to end consumers as they now need to bury loved ones a lot quicker than ordinarily they'd want to.
Yeah, I mean, now we've spoken about the funeral parlours and how they are navigating the space, but how do consumers then mitigate against those increasing costs that you've just spoken about? I mean, it doesn't have to be an extravagant funeral that you described earlier, but something decent for a decent send-off for a loved one. How do consumers mitigate against those costs?
Sure. I think there are a couple of buckets that consumers need to consider. I think the first bucket that I think is important is planning beforehand. Because in absence of having the appropriate provision to bury a loved one, it means that you have to rely on credit. Yeah. And I spoke about interest rates a bit earlier on, and because the interest rates are so high, consumers will have to spend a lot more on a funeral if they rely on credit. So the appropriate provision before someone passes on, I think, is critical. And consumers may be asking themselves, what does it mean? How much is enough? Yeah. And I think there are a number of insurance companies who can help consumers on this journey to decide to firstly determine how much is enough, and also help them plan for the eventuality that someone passes on. I think that first part is critical. And what we find is that consumers don't talk and solve for the first part, the planning, find themselves knocked into a different life when someone does pass on, because they need to rely on credit and or matronisa and the like, which can be quite expensive. And then the second component is to mitigate the costs. When someone does pass on, it's important as a family to understand how much is at your disposal to spend on the funeral. Being clear on that, I think, is critical, and then budgeting as to how you're going to spend this money for this particular funeral, I think, is critical. Now, you can ask yourself, when someone passes on, you're emotional. Yeah. It's a tough time. How can you expect people to be rational and budget during that time? And that's why we really do encourage you to partner with a family friend and the like to help you through that process. But I think it's critical to budget before the funeral, before you start spending, so that you spend within your bounds, and then naturally tracking the budget going forward. Your point around lavish funerals, look, we don't discourage families from wanting to celebrate their loved ones. I think it's important. The reality is that's a last event that will be hosted in the name of that loved one. And so it's critical that you do, however, spend within what you can afford. Because in absence of that, you take on credit as a consumer, and then you're paying for the funeral indefinitely, even after the funeral itself. So I think that's kind of what we recommend to customers, is to first have the appropriate provision, budget when it happens, and then spend within your means. Otherwise, then the cost can run away with you.
We have run out of time, but I have to ask you this very briefly. Have you found over the last 3 years with COVID, inflationary pressures and so, that customers are a little bit more reluctant to take out policies that will help them in the eventuality that a loved one will pass away, or it was the first thing that they cut when it came to managing expenses amid losing jobs or earning less because of the pandemic?
Yeah. So what we've seen is sales volumes across the industry have kept on being quite healthy. So consumers are still quite aware of COVID and quite aware of their mortality. The big challenge, to your point, is affordability. So whilst consumers are buying these products, what we're seeing across the industry is that a lot of consumers can't afford, and therefore are then lapsing their policies as a result. To your point, insurance is one of the first goods that consumers stop paying when things are tough. But funny enough, in South Africa, funeral insurance specifically is not one of the first goods. They'll stop paying all the other insurance, but funeral, because of the importance of funeral from a cultural perspective in South Africa. So that's what we're saying. Sales are still quite healthy. However, customers are struggling to pay, which is resulting in lapses or persistency not being so great. And we expect sales to continue to be healthy and persistency to unfortunately deteriorate. But look, these funeral policies are structured in a way that allows customers to customize them to meet their affordability needs. So there's no reason why a customer can't engage with the insurer that's providing the funeral policy to structure it to meet their affordability needs, as opposed to lapsing it. Because the reality is, death is inevitable, and the reality is at some point they might need that provision.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for those interesting insights. That is Abulela Gazi, who's the Executive Head of Client and Business Solutions at Metropolitan. The impact that the power cuts are having on the funeral industry, both those who operate within it, but consumers who are now forced to bury their loved ones a lot earlier than they would originally prefer to.